Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger.
Things you didn't know about the Challenger disaster that will blow your mind. There are moments in history that split time in two, a before and an after. January 28, 1986 is one of those moments. Millions of Americans were watching their televisions that Tuesday morning, many of them school children who had been wheeled into gymnasiums and classrooms specifically to witness what was supposed to be a triumph. A teacher was going to space. An ordinary person, someone like the adults standing at the front of their classrooms, was going to float above the Earth and wave back at them from orbit. It was meant to be the kind of moment that made a generation fall in love with science, with exploration, with the idea that the sky was no longer a limit. Instead, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart over the Atlantic Ocean, and the world watched in stunned, uncomprehending silence, as a plume of smoke carved a terrible Y shape across a bright blue Florida sky. For most people, the story of Challenger begins and ends there. A tragedy, a malfunction, a rubber seal that failed in cold weather. And that version of events is not wrong, exactly, but it is dangerously incomplete. Because the story of Challenger is not simply the story of a mechanical failure. It is the story of what happens when warning signs are ignored long enough that they stop feeling like warnings. It is the story of institutional pressure crushing individual conscience. It is the story of engineers who begged, who genuinely begged, for someone in authority to listen, and were silenced not by cruelty, but by something more insidious, the slow, grinding machinery of bureaucratic momentum. And it is, in its most disturbing passages, the story of 7 human beings who may have been alive and aware as their crew cabin fell from 65,000 feet toward the cold Atlantic below. What follows are the things most people were never told. The details that didn't make it into the textbooks, the facts that NASA initially withheld, and the revelations that continue to emerge decades after the world watched that plume of smoke expand across the sky. Once you know these things, you will never look at the Challenger story the same way again. To understand why Challenger happened, you have to understand the world NASA was operating in during the early 1980s. The Apollo era, that golden, almost mythological period of moon landings and astronaut heroes, had ended in 1972. What followed was something far more complicated. Congress began cutting budgets. Public enthusiasm, which had been electric during the moon race, cooled considerably once the achievement was secured. NASA was left in the uncomfortable position of having conquered the greatest frontier in human history, and then being asked to justify its continued existence. The answer arrived. It was the Space Shuttle, a reusable orbiter that could launch like a rocket, carry people and cargo to orbit, and then glide back to Earth like a plane. It was a brilliant concept. It was also a concept that was compromised from the very beginning. The original vision for the shuttle included liquid-fueled rocket boosters, which offered engineers the ability to throttle down or even shut off the engines if something went wrong during ascent. That option was rejected. The reason was money. Liquid-fueled systems are expensive, complex, and slow to develop. Instead, NASA selected solid-fueled rocket boosters manufactured by a Utah-based company called Morton Thiokol, which had strong political and contractual ties to the space agency. Solid rockets are simpler and cheaper to produce. They are also, in a critical sense, unforgiving. Once a solid rocket booster is ignited, it cannot be switched off. It burns until the fuel is exhausted. If something goes wrong after ignition, there is no abort option, no throttle down, no second chance. The crew is committed from the moment the flame begins. The boosters were also built in segments rather than as single continuous cylinders, a decision driven by the practical reality of transporting them from a factory in Utah to the launch site in Florida. Individual segments could be shipped by rail and then assembled on site. Each segment was joined to the next using what engineers called a field joint, and those joints were sealed with rubber gaskets known as O-rings. These O-rings were designed to compress under pressure and expand with heat, forming an airtight barrier against the superheated gases produced during combustion. On paper, the design was sound. In practice, it introduced a vulnerability that engineers identified almost immediately and spent years trying to get someone to address. As early as 1977, nearly a decade before the Challenger accident, NASA engineers had identified potential problems with the O-ring joint design. After the shuttle began flying in 1981, the concerns multiplied. Post-flight inspections revealed soot and burn marks near the O-rings on multiple missions. These marks were evidence that the seals had not held perfectly, that hot gas had at least partially penetrated the joint. In some cases, only the secondary O-ring, the backup seal, had prevented a catastrophic gas escape. In engineering terms, this meant the system had been operating without a functioning safety margin. If the secondary ring failed in the same way the primary had, there would be nothing left to stop superheated combustion gases from burning through the side of the booster and into the external fuel tank. Roger Boisjoli was a senior engineer at Morton Thiokol who had spent years working on the solid rocket booster program. By 1985, he had become genuinely alarmed by the pattern of O-ring damage he was seeing in post-flight analysis. After examining the results of a mission that had flown in January of that year in colder-than-average temperatures, he noticed that the O-ring damage was more extensive than on any previous flight. He understood immediately what this meant. The cold was affecting the resilience of the rubber, making it slower to seat properly in the joint, and therefore more likely to allow gas to escape. He wrote a formal memo to his superiors in July of 1985, warning in direct and unambiguous language that if the O-ring problem was not resolved, NASA risked the loss of a vehicle and its crew. The memo was detailed, technically rigorous, and deeply urgent. It was filed away. No corrective action was taken. Alan MacDonald, Boisjoli's colleague and the director of the Solid Rocket Motor Project at Thiokol, shared these concerns. Both men would later describe the experience of watching their warnings be absorbed and neutralized by the organizational culture around them as one of the most frustrating and ultimately heartbreaking experiences of their professional lives. They were not ignored because anyone thought they were wrong. They were sidelined because the launch schedule had taken on a life of its own, and that schedule had become, in the minds of NASA management, something close to sacred. By the mid-1980s, the shuttle program was under enormous pressure to perform. NASA had promised Congress and the paying customers who were booking cargo space on shuttle missions a launch rate of up to 24 flights per year. The reality was that each shuttle mission required weeks of preparation, inspection, and repair between flights. The two realities were not compatible, but admitting that would have meant admitting that the shuttle program was not the cost-effective, routine workhorse that NASA had sold to the public and to its government patrons. So instead of slowing down, the agency accelerated. Delays were scrutinized. Engineers who raised concerns were asked to prove that their concerns justified the financial and political cost of postponement, a standard that placed the burden of proof in exactly the wrong direction. Ordinarily, you need to prove something is safe before you fly. At NASA, in 1986, the unspoken requirement was that you had to prove it was unsafe before they would agree not to. This inversion of standard safety logic is what the sociologist Diane Vaughan later described, in her landmark study of the disaster, as the normalization of deviance. The O-rings had been eroding on flight after flight, each time the shuttle returned safely. That erosion was reclassified in the minds of managers from an alarming anomaly to a known and therefore tolerable phenomenon. The data wasn't being ignored, it was being reinterpreted. Engineers saw a trend pointing toward catastrophe. Managers saw a trend of repeated missions without catastrophe. They were looking at the same numbers and arriving at opposite conclusions, and the managers had the authority. On the evening of January 27, 1986, the night before Challenger's final launch, a teleconference was held between engineers at Morton Thiokol and managers at NASA. The launch had already been delayed multiple times, and the forecast for the following morning showed temperatures well below freezing at Cape Canaveral. Roger Boisjoli and a team of Thiokol engineers argued forcefully that the launch should be postponed. They presented data on the relationship between temperature and O-ring resilience. They showed charts. They cited the erosion patterns from previous cold weather flights. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The O-rings had never been tested at temperatures as low as those predicted for the next morning, and there was no engineering basis for proceeding with the launch. Initially, Morton Thiokol management supported the engineers' recommendation to delay. But NASA's response to that recommendation was, according to multiple accounts, one of barely concealed frustration. One NASA manager, Lawrence Malloy, reportedly responded to the no-launch recommendation by saying words to the effect of, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The pressure was unmistakable. Thiokol management asked for a few minutes off the teleconference to discuss the situation privately. During that break, one manager told the engineers to stop thinking like engineers and start thinking like managers. When they returned to the call, Thiokol had reversed its position. The engineers had been overruled, not on the basis of any new data, but on the basis of institutional pressure. Alan McDonald refused to sign off on the launch recommendation. He told the NASA official at Cape Canaveral that he would not put his name on a document authorizing the launch under those conditions. He was, in effect, pushed aside. Roger Boisterly, sitting in the room as the decision was made, later described the moment Thiokol management reversed course as one of the worst of his life. He knew, he said, that they were going to fly, and he knew what that meant. He walked away from the teleconference and spent a sleepless night dreading what the morning would bring. Challenger launched at 11:38 in the morning on January 28, 1986. The temperature at the launch pad was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, far colder than any previous shuttle launch. The launch had already been delayed from earlier that morning due to ice concerns, and technicians had spent hours monitoring ice formation on the launch structure. 1 second after ignition, cameras at the launch complex captured something troubling: a puff of black smoke near the lower field joint of the right solid rocket booster. Cold had done exactly what Boisterly had predicted. The O-ring had stiffened, failed to seat properly, and allowed a